Imagine this, an 8-year-old girl standing up in a packed courtroom, her small voice cutting through the silence like a thunderclap. He's lying. The gavel slams down, but she won't be silenced. Not today. Not when everything that matters hangs in the balance. Picture little Sophie Bennett, her hands trembling as they grip the edge of the witness stand. Her navy blue dress perfectly pressed against her rigid spine. Her dark curls frame a face too serious for a child her age. Her eyes, a mirror of her mother's, burning with a truth she can no longer contain. The judge's mouth falls open in shock. The court reporter's fingers freeze mid-type. And her stepfather, Richard Coleman? His confident smile evaporates like morning dew under a scorching sun. Let me take you back to how we got here. Sophie wasn't always caught between two worlds. Half black like her mother Emily, half white like her biological father who'd left before she was born. Sophie had found stability when Richard entered their lives 3 years ago. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. Behind closed doors, a different Richard emerged. The same man who held Emily's hand at community events would later mutter about her overreacting when store security followed her through department stores. The same man who proudly introduced his beautiful blended family to colleagues would casually suggest Emily straighten Sophie's hair for special occasions. Emily's depression crashed over her like a tidal wave after her mother died last year. The woman who'd raised her alone, who'd taught her to stand tall when the world tried to shrink her, was gone. And Richard, he saw an opportunity. The custody battle turned ugly fast. Richard's attorney painted Emily as emotionally unstable, unfit to parent. What judge wouldn't worry about a child living with a mother who sometimes couldn't get out of bed? What judge wouldn't be impressed by a stepfather who coached Little League and volunteered at school functions? What no one knew was that Sophie had become invisible in her own home, a ghost witnessing everything, understanding more than anyone realized. The same little girl who could troubleshoot computer problems her teachers couldn't solve had been watching, listening, learning. She saw how Richard turned cold when cameras weren't rolling, how he'd check his watch impatiently when Emily tried to explain her feelings, how he'd roll his eyes when Sophie asked for help with homework, telling her to figure it out herself. She was smart enough, wasn't she? But the computer became Sophie's window. Late at night, when Richard thought everyone was asleep, the soft blue glow of his laptop illuminated a truth he never meant for anyone to discover. And now, in this courtroom, with her mother's future, her future, hanging by a thread, Sophie Bennett wasn't just a little girl anymore. She was about to become the storm that would blow Richard's perfect façade to pieces. The wheels of justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. At least that's what Emily's attorney kept telling her. But for Sophie, watching her mother shrink smaller with each court appearance, those wheels seemed designed to crush rather than deliver justice. Richard knew exactly how to play the system. Picture him in the courthouse hallway, his arm casually draped around Emily's shoulder when others were watching. His voice honey-smooth, as he assured her everything would work out fairly. But the moment they were alone, his face would harden into stone. Do you really think anyone will believe you over me? Look at yourself, Emily. You can barely function. The court-appointed evaluator visited their home on a Tuesday. Richard had prepared for days, fresh flowers on the table, Sophie's artwork prominently displayed. He spoke softly, respectfully, highlighting Emily's good qualities, while subtly emphasizing her challenges. Sophie, honey, remember how Mommy couldn't take you to your recital because she was having one of her bad days? That was so disappointing for you, wasn't it? Emily's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes downcast as Richard painted himself as the patient, supportive husband who'd reached his breaking point. The evaluator's pen scratched across her notepad, documenting every word. But it was what happened after the evaluator left that changed everything. Richard's friends came over that Friday night. Sophie was supposed to be asleep, but the raised voices drew her to the top of the stairs. Richard and 3 buddies, beers in hand, laughing in the kitchen below. I'm telling you, it's a slam dunk, Richard said, his voice looser than Sophie had ever heard it. The depression thing is gold in court. Her lawyer's trying to play the race card, but with my record versus hers? Please, One of his friends chuckled. You always did have a thing for exotic women. Rich. Should have known it would bite you in the ass. Richard's laugh turned cold. Yeah, well, lesson learned. You wouldn't believe the drama. Everything's racism, this microaggression that, like, sorry your job interview didn't go well, but maybe it's just you, not your skin color? Sophie's chest tightened, her small fingers gripping the banister until her knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was about who her mother was, who she was. The next morning, Richard left for his golf game, and something pulled Sophie toward his home office. The laptop password was Easy Sophie's birthday. Richard thought it made him look like a devoted stepfather. What it really did was give Sophie access to everything. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through message after message between Richard and someone named Vanessa. Their plans laid bare in black and white. Once I get custody, the child support will be substantial. Emily makes good money when she's actually working. Give it 6 months, we'll be set up in California, and my mom can help with Sophie when you're busy. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't a daughter to him. She was a paycheck. Then came the sound that turned her blood to ice, the garage door opening. Richard, home early. He found her there, staring at his screen, tears streaming down her face. His transformation was instant and terrifying. The mask dropped completely. If you tell anyone about this, he whispered, his face inches from hers, no one will believe you. They'll think your mother put you up to it, and that will be the final nail in her coffin. Is that what you want? To destroy her completely? But that night, while Richard slept soundly, confident in his victory, Sophie crept back downstairs with her tablet. Click by click, she captured everything, the messages, the dates, the plans. The court dates continued. Richard charmed everyone, the mediator, the court reporter, even the bailiff. Judge Harris nodded approvingly as Richard detailed his plans for Sophie's education, her extracurriculars, her future. Emily's testimony, in contrast, seemed fragmented, emotional, exactly what everyone expected from a woman struggling with mental health issues. If you're watching this right now and you've ever been silenced, if you've ever known a truth that no one would believe, stay with me. Because sometimes the smallest voice in the room is about to become the loudest. The final hearing arrived. Emily's attorney looked defeated before they even began. Richard took the stand, the picture of concerned fatherhood in his carefully selected blue tie, trustworthy, dependable blue. Sophie clutched her tablet to her chest, waiting. The moment was coming. The storm was about to break. The courtroom felt smaller than ever as Richard sat on the witness stand, his voice smooth as polished marble. My relationship with Sophie has always been my priority, Your Honor. Since Emily's struggles began, I've been the one constant in Sophie's life. Every school event, every doctor's appointment, homework help every night. I've been the one tucking her in when her mother couldn't even get out of bed. Sophie's fists clenched in her lap, her knuckles turning white against the navy blue fabric of her dress. Each lie landed like a physical blow. The nights she'd spent sitting beside her mother's bed, both of them holding each other through the darkness. The school events where she'd searched the crowd for Richard's face, never finding it. The homework she'd completed alone at the kitchen table while Richard worked late, or so he claimed. Judge Harris nodded sympathetically as Richard continued his performance. I'm simply asking for what's best for Sophie. Emily is a good person, but right now, she's not capable of providing the stability Sophie needs. Emily's shoulders curved inward, her attorney whispering something in her ear. The weight of inevitability pressed down on them both. Richard was winning. The system was working exactly as he'd planned. And would you say your relationship with Sophie is? Judge Harris began. He's lying. Sophie's voice cut through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The gavel slammed down immediately. Young lady, you cannot interrupt these proceedings. The judge's stern voice silenced the murmurs that had erupted around the room. But Sophie was on her feet now, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. Please, I need to tell you something important. Judge Harris's expression shifted, the lines around his eyes softening slightly. Children in his courtroom rarely spoke up so boldly. This is highly irregular, but what is it you want to say, Sophie? Richard's attorney jumped up. Your Honor, this is clearly inappropriate. The child has obviously been coached. Richard's eyes locked with Sophie's, a silent warning that made her stomach twist. But she was beyond fear now. The truth burned too brightly inside her to be contained any longer. He's never there, Sophie began, her voice small but growing stronger with each word. He doesn't help with homework. He doesn't tuck me in. When Mom is having a hard day, I'm the one who sits with her. I make us both dinner. I tell her stories until she smiles again. The courtroom had gone completely still, all eyes fixed on the small figure standing beside the wooden barrier. And I found something on his computer, Sophie continued, her fingers tightening around her tablet. Something he didn't want anyone to see. Richard's face had drained of all color. Your Honor, this is absurd. She's clearly been coached by her mother. I wasn't, Sophie insisted, her voice rising. I know how to use computers. Way better than him. He doesn't even use different passwords. She tapped on her tablet screen, bringing up the first saved message. I found these conversations between him and someone named Vanessa. They were planning to move to California after he gets custody of me. Sophie's voice dropped as she read directly from the screen. He said, once I have full custody, I can claim more child support from Emily while Vanessa takes care of Sophie. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harris's mouth fell open in shock, his gavel forgotten in his hand. Richard's attorney frantically tried to object over the growing noise. But Sophie wasn't finished. There's more, she said, her voice somehow cutting through the chaos. I found other messages too, about money he's been hiding from his business. He told Vanessa they'd have enough money to buy a beach house once the divorce is final because he's been keeping 2 sets of books for years. Judge Harris finally found his voice. Bailiff, please approach the bench. Young lady, those are very serious accusations. Do you understand what you're saying? Sophie nodded solemnly. I took pictures of everything with my tablet. Mom doesn't know. Nobody knows. I've been waiting to tell someone who would believe me. Richard surged to his feet. This is preposterous. The wild imagination of a child trying to protect her mother. Your Honor, you can't possibly. Sit down, Mr. Coleman, Judge Harris commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Bailiff, please escort Ms. Bennett's attorney to review whatever evidence the child has. As Sophie's tablet was carefully taken from her hands, something extraordinary happened. A woman stood up in the back of the courtroom, dark-skinned with a headscarf wrapped elegantly around her head. She moved forward with purpose. I'm sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, but I think I need to speak. My name is Adana Okafor. Richard Coleman and I were engaged 3 years ago, before he met Emily. The judge's eyebrows shot upward. And your purpose for being here today, Ms. Okafor? I received a subpoena from Emily's attorney last week. I've been sitting here listening to Richard, and it's like reliving my own nightmare. The manipulations, the lies, the way he used my immigration status against me when I started questioning his business practices. If you're watching this and thinking that justice never comes, that the powerful always win, I need you to keep watching. Because sometimes, justice arrives in unexpected ways. Judge Harris turned to Richard, whose confident demeanor had completely crumbled. The mask was slipping, revealing glimpses of the man Sophie had come to fear behind closed doors. We will take a 30-minute recess, the judge announced, after which Mr. Coleman and his attorney will explain these allegations. His gaze swept the courtroom before landing on Sophie. And young lady, I want to thank you for your courage today. As Sophie was escorted from the stand, she locked eyes with her stepfather one last time. The hatred in his gaze made her blood run cold. But there was something else there too, fear. Because Richard Coleman knew his carefully constructed world was crumbling beneath his feet. What Sophie didn't know yet was that Richard's messages contained evidence of much more than financial impropriety and custody manipulation. And as the bailiff guided her toward her mother's waiting arms, she couldn't see Judge Harris motioning for the district attorney to join them in his chambers urgently. The storm Sophie had unleashed was just beginning to gather strength. The 30-minute recess stretched into 3 hours. Sophie and Emily sat in a small conference room, surrounded by a growing team of attorneys. Sophie's tablet passed from hand to hand, each new person's eyes widening as they scrolled through her evidence. Emily kept her arm wrapped around Sophie's shoulders, her voice a whisper against her daughter's hair. "You did this all by yourself? Why didn't you tell me?" Sophie leaned into her mother's embrace. "I was scared. Richard said if I told anyone, they'd think you put me up to it. That it would make things worse for you." Emily's eyes welled with tears, but they weren't the hollow tears Sophie had grown accustomed to seeing. These burned with something different, determination, perhaps even hope. When they finally returned to the courtroom, everything had changed. Richard sat at the defense table, no longer the confident accuser but the accused. His attorney leaned close, whispering urgently in his ear as additional law enforcement officers entered the room. Judge Harris surveyed the scene, his expression grave. Before he could speak, Richard's attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client requests a brief continuance to consider his position." The judge's response was immediate. "Request denied. We will proceed." What followed wasn't just the resolution of a custody case. It was the unraveling of years of calculated manipulation and deceit. Financial records were ordered unsealed. Previous relationships scrutinized. The evidence Sophie had accidentally uncovered became the first thread that, when pulled, revealed a tapestry of fraud extending far beyond their family. Judge Harris's voice resonated through the courtroom as he delivered his ruling. "In my 40 years on this bench, I have seen many attempts to manipulate this court. But rarely have I seen such calculated efforts to weaponize a mother's mental health struggles and racial bias for financial gain." Sophie felt her mother's grip tighten on her hand. "Based on the evidence before me, this court awards full physical and legal custody of Sophie Bennett to her mother, Emily Bennett, effective immediately." The judge paused, turning his attention directly to Richard. "Mr. Coleman, you are hereby ordered to vacate the family residence within 24 hours. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into charges of perjury, attempted fraud, and financial crimes evidenced in these proceedings." Richard's face contorted with rage, the mask completely gone now. "This is ridiculous. She's manipulated all of you. She's not even stable enough to—" "That's enough, Mr. Coleman." Judge Harris cut him off. "One more word and I'll hold you in contempt." The gavel came down with finality, but this was just the beginning. In the days that followed, federal investigators descended on Richard's business. Former clients came forward. Bank accounts were frozen. The man who had so confidently walked into court certain of victory left in handcuffs, facing charges that went far beyond family court. Imagine this 1 year later, a different courtroom. Sophie, now 9, sits beside her mother as Richard Coleman enters in an orange jumpsuit to hear his sentence for multiple counts of financial fraud, tax evasion, and perjury. Emily squeezes Sophie's hand as the judge pronounces a 7-year sentence. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters gather, microphones thrust toward them both. "Emily, how does it feel to have this chapter finally closing?" One reporter calls out. Emily smiles, more confident than Sophie has seen her in years. The medication is working properly now, the therapy helping rebuild what Richard had tried to tear down. It's not about closing chapters. It's about writing new ones. She turns to Sophie, who beams up at her with pride. Her mother is writing a book now, sharing their story and helping other women recognize the warning signs of emotional and financial abuse. The depression hasn't disappeared, but it no longer defines her. Later that evening, Sophie sits at their kitchen table, their new kitchen in their new apartment, walls covered with Sophie's artwork and photos of Emily's supportive family. Her laptop is open to a video chat with other kids who have survived family trauma. Sophie has become something of a young advocate, speaking at her school about trusting your instincts, about the importance of speaking up. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell your truth, Sophie tells the group, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone far beyond her years. Even when the whole world thinks you're too young to know it. That night, as Emily tucks Sophie into bed, really tucks her in, with a story and a kiss and the promise of pancakes in the morning, Sophie looks up at her mother. "Do you think anyone else will listen to our story and feel braver?" Emily smooths Sophie's curls away from her forehead. I know they will, sweetheart, because truth has a power all its own. And they're right, because you're listening right now, aren't you? This isn't just a story about a custody battle or even about racism in the family court system. It's about what happens when we believe children, when we recognize that even the smallest among us can speak truth to power, when we understand that justice may come slowly, but it does come. Sophie Bennett stepped into a courtroom expecting no one to believe her. Instead, she changed not just her own life but her mother's, and perhaps, if you're still watching, a small piece of yours too. Because sometimes justice wears a navy blue dress and stands just tall enough to see over the witness stand. Sometimes salvation comes not from those with power, but from those we've taught to be powerless. And sometimes the most important voice in the room belongs to the person we least expect to speak. What truth are you waiting to tell?